In this custom-tailored deep dive, we're exploring a highly provocative Spanish text titled The Great Farce. And it's basically a surgical look at the mechanics of mass deception.
Yeah, it uses the infamous propaganda and, well, the cover-ups of Nazi Germany as a baseline, and then compares that to a controversial thesis about the alleged survival and modern manipulation tactics of Spanish fascism.
But before we go any further, we need to establish the ground rules for unpacking this specific material.
Yes, absolutely crucial disclaimer here. The source material throws extremely heavy punches in every conceivable direction. I mean, it targets the extreme right, it targets the institutional left in Spain, specifically the PSOE, it goes after the Catholic Church, and it takes direct aim at the Spanish monarchy.
Right, it leaves virtually no modern Spanish institution unscathed. It's intense.
It is. So we want to be incredibly clear with you, the listener. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of these viewpoints or validating these specific accusations.
Exactly. Our job today is strictly to act as a mirror. We're just going to impartially unpack the source's claims so that you can analyze the mechanics of this alleged manipulation machine.
Right, we're looking entirely at the how and the why of the arguments presented in the text, nothing more.
So, to start, the text sets a historical baseline by looking at the undisputed masters of mass deception, which would be Nazi Germany. Now, when most of us think of Nazi propaganda, we think of, the idea that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth.
Right, the classic Goebbels concept.
Yeah, but the source focuses specifically on their desperate attempts to hide their crimes when the walls actually started closing in.
Well, the source details how they were experts at false flags from the very beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, it mentions the 1939 Gleiwitz incident.
Remind me, that was the radio station, right?
Exactly. The Nazis essentially faked a Polish attack on a German radio station just to justify starting World War II.
Which is horrifying.
It is.
Yeah.
And they deceived the Soviet Union with non-aggression pacts. They even deceived the Red Cross by building entirely fake, idyllic theatrical sets in concentration camps.
Wait, theatrical sets?
Yeah, they forced well-fed prisoners to act out a comfortable life just to hide the reality of the extermination from international inspectors.
That is just so dark. But the truly chilling part of the text focuses on what happened at the end of the war. There was this sheer panic among the Nazi leadership about, quote, looking ugly to history.
Right, the massive erasure efforts.
Yeah, the scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile death squads, had murdered roughly 1.3 million people in Eastern Europe. And the source describes how, as the Soviet troops advanced, the Nazis literally forced enslaved prisoners to dig up massive mass graves.
To burn the decaying bodies.
Yes, burn them and plant trees over the ashes. They were literally trying to landscape over an atrocity.
And they dismantled extermination camps entirely. I mean, they blew up gas chambers and murdered the prisoners forced to work in the crematoriums, specifically to ensure there were zero witnesses left alive to testify.
Right.
But the text brings up a specific, terrifying example to illustrate the absolute extreme of this cover-up mentality. It was known as the Leiter Plan, or Plan Feuerzeug, at the Mauthausen camp complex.
The Leiter Plan. So what was the actual mechanism there?
Well, to leave absolutely no trace, the Nazi leaders devised the plan to lure surviving prisoners, including people who had just barely survived brutal death marches into underground cave factories near Mauthausen.
And the text explicitly notes that the plan included local Austrian civilians as well, right?
Yes, exactly. These were sympathetic Nazi civilians who just happened to live near the camps. The regime realized these locals had seen too much.
So they were liabilities.
Exactly. So their own loyal citizens were to be lured into these caves right alongside the prisoners.
And the cover story they used was built on a genuine fear. The lie was basically, hey, come into the caves, you'll be protected from the Allied bombing raids.
It was a perfectly crafted deception. Because once everyone was inside, the plan was to detonate massive explosives at the cave entrances, sealing them in to starve to death.
God, that's just...
And it was a method they had already tested in smaller capacities within the Mauthausen complex.
Right. But the text notes that in the larger camps, the prisoners were highly organized. They caught wind of the Leiter Plan and actually revolted.
Yeah, they managed to inform Louis Heifliger, who was a delegate for the Swiss Red Cross.
And he desperately tipped off General Patton's advancing American troops. When Patton's forces arrived at one of the caves, they found the explosives already rigged and ready to blow. It was that close.
It really was. And the text uses this Nazi baseline to establish a crucial contrast. I mean, the Nazis, despite all this frantic sociopathic effort to erase history, they ultimately failed.
Because the horror was just too vast to hide.
That and their military completely collapsed. They faced brutal international scrutiny at the Nuremberg trials. Their deception was dragged into the daylight by an outside force.
Which brings us to the core thesis of our deep dive today. The text argues that Spanish fascism is an entirely different beast. The question is, how does a fascist system survive if it isn't conquered?
Right, because Franco didn't die in a bunker while foreign armies shelled his capital. He died in his bed in 1975.
Spain didn't have a Nuremberg.
Exactly. There was no definitive, gavel-striking moment of international condemnation. The fascist deep state didn't die. It simply adapted.
Right, so the same judges, the same police forces, and the same economic elites integrated right into the new modern democracy, operating in plain sight.
Yeah, and the author describes exposing this Spanish system as being like fighting ghosts. Because there's no official historical sentence condemning the architects of the regime, if you try to point out their methods today, well, you are the one who gets labeled as a paranoid conspiracy theorist.
It becomes a question of evolution. I mean, if an ideological machine is given the luxury of time and total control, it doesn't just stagnate.
It adapts.
It adapts perfectly to its environment.
And the journey this text takes us on to prove that adaptation is just wild. We're going to explore rewritten wars, entirely erased geopolitical alliances.
Fake concentration camp survivors.
Yes, mass hysteria, modern-day false flag operations designed to basically hijack the media ecosystem.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how a machine like this operates in the 21st century, we have to go back to the blueprint.
We have to look at the Spanish Civil War.
1936? Right, 1936. Because the source argues that this fascist manipulation machine, it wasn't born out of some grand immediate desire for world domination.
It wasn't like a Bond villain plot.
No, not at all. It was born out of pure, desperate necessity. They needed to justify a coup d'etat against a legitimate democratic government.
The Second Spanish Republic.
Exactly. And to understand the magnitude of the lie that was constructed, you first have to understand what the Republic was actually attempting to achieve and why it terrified the reactionary forces in Spain so profoundly.
Right, because they were changing everything.
The historical context provided by the text paints the Second Republic as a government attempting to drag a highly unequal society into the modern era. I mean, their primary goal was creating a secular democratic state.
Which was a massive shift.
A huge shift. And a massive part of that involved lifting the population out of widespread illiteracy and crushing poverty.
Because at that time, Spain had staggering rates of literacy, right? Like a huge portion of the rural population just couldn't read or write.
Absolutely. So the Republic launched initiatives like the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, the Free Institution of Education. They were actively trying to remove the monopoly on education that the Catholic Church had held for centuries.
They wanted public schools.
Public schools training thousands of secular teachers and systemically breaking down the entrenched classism that completely defined Spanish society at the time.
And obviously, if you are the entrenched power, if you're the wealthy landowning elite, the conservative military establishment, or powerful religious groups like the Jesuits.
Who were incredibly powerful.
Right. The source notes they were incredibly influential in Spain and represented the Vatican's largest sect worldwide. If you're them, you aren't going to just sit back and applaud while your power and influence are legislated out of existence.
Precisely. I mean, the Republic's reforms were an existential threat to the old order. In fact, the Republic even attempted to ban the Jesuits entirely because of their immense political and economic influence over the state.
Wow. Ban them entirely.
Yeah. So when the conservative military forces launched their coup, they needed a compelling narrative. You cannot rally a population to fight a bloody, brutal civil war by saying, hey, we're launching this coup because we want to maintain our monopoly on wealth and ensure the peasantry remains uneducated.
It doesn't exactly inspire people to pick up a rifle.
No, it really doesn't. You need a villain.
You need a monster.
Exactly. So they framed the Republic's democratic and educational reforms as this apocalyptic conspiracy aimed at the soul of Spain itself. They took every perceived enemy of the traditional order and merged them into one terrifying, monolithic boogeyman.
The Judeo-Masonic communist anarchist conspiracy.
That's the one.
It's the ultimate kitchen sink conspiracy theory. You just throw every possible threat into a blender. You've got the Jewish population, the Freemasons, the Soviet-backed communists, and the anarchists, all supposedly sitting in a smoke-filled room working together to destroy Catholic Spain.
Right, which makes no sense.
It's absurd if you spend 5 seconds thinking about it. I mean, communists and anarchists historically despise each other, let alone teaming up with Freemasons. But when you completely control the narrative, you can make people believe it.
Because you control the flow of information?
Exactly. And that brings us to how they manage the narrative during the actual violence of the war. The source spends significant time on the bombing of Guernica, which is easily one of the most infamous events of the conflict, largely because Pablo Picasso immortalized the horror in his painting.
Yeah, the author uses Guernica as a masterclass in the absolute manipulation of reality. The historical reality, as documented and accepted globally today, is that the town of Guernica was obliterated by the Nazi Condor Legion.
It was a Nazi operation.
Completely. It was, quite literally, a live-fire testing ground for the German Luftwaffe. The text details how Nazi aviators would bomb these defenseless civilian towns, and then German officers would simply drive their cars into the smoldering ruins afterward.
Wait, they would just drive in?
Just drive right in. They would take notes, observe the structural damage to the buildings, analyze the blast patterns, and send detailed technical reports back to Berlin.
To prepare for World War II.
Exactly. To prepare for the blitzkrieg tactics. It was a cold, clinical, psychopathic experiment in terror bombing.
It's sickening to think about. Treating a town full of human beings as an explosive testing site. But here is the mechanism of the manipulation. The fascist regime in Spain couldn't admit to their own people that their foreign Nazi allies were slaughtering Spanish civilians from the sky.
Right, that's terrible PR.
So what did they do? They engaged in what is essentially narrative laundering. They looked at a town flattened by German incendiary bombs, and they told the world and the Spanish public that the retreating Republican forces had burned their own city to the ground.
They washed the blood off their allies.
And painted it directly onto their enemies.
And they pushed this fabricated narrative relentlessly through every channel of communication they controlled. The sheer audacity of the lie is staggering. I mean, you have survivors standing in the rubble who looked up and saw the German planes.
They knew what happened.
They knew. But the regime's propaganda machine was so overwhelming, so pervasive in the press and on the radio, that they successfully convinced a massive portion of the population that the Republicans were the ones who destroyed Guernica.
But I have to push back a little here, because it's one thing to lie about a bombing when communication is limited in the 1930s. How do you successfully rewrite the loyalties of your own military?
What do you mean?
Like, if this was a military coup against the government, surely not every soldier and commander went along with it. How do you erase the people who stood against you, the loyalists?
You do it with absolute ruthless finality, followed by systematic historical erasure. The regime didn't just lie about events. They literally vaporized democratic heroes from the historical record.
They just deleted them.
Yes. And the source provides a chillingly specific example of this. Commander Ricardo de la Puente Bahamonde.
And the crucial detail here, he was Francisco Franco's own cousin.
Yes, his first cousin. When the coup happened, Commander de la Puente Bahamonde remained steadfastly loyal to the Democratic Republic. He was in command of an airfield in Morocco.
So he had actual power.
He did. Realizing the fascist rebels were advancing, and to prevent his aircraft from falling into their hands to be used against the Republic, he ordered his own planes to be destroyed.
Oh.
He prioritized his sworn duty to the legitimate government over his own blood ties to the leader of the rebellion.
That is an incredible act of bravery and principle. In any functioning democratic country today, that man is in the history textbooks. He has bronze statues in town squares. He is taught in military academies as the ultimate example of a soldier upholding his oath to the Constitution, despite immense personal pressure.
That is what should have happened, but the text explains what actually occurred. Franco ordered his own cousin to be executed in the very first days of the coup.
His own cousin.
Yes, and then the propaganda machine went to work erasing him. They didn't just kill the man, they killed his memory. The source points out the tragic reality that even today, in modern, supposedly democratic Spain, the story of Commander de la Puente Bahamonde is virtually unknown to the general public.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. The entire Republican military infrastructure that stayed loyal to the democracy has been practically scrubbed from existence in the national consciousness.
While at the same time, the heroes the regime did choose to elevate were completely fabricated out of thin air. The text dives into the myth of the Alcazar of Toledo and General Moscardo.
Oh, right. The great myth.
If you grew up during the dictatorship, This story was foundational to the regime's mythology. It was their Alamo, the brave general holding out in the fortress, famously receiving a phone call where he sacrifices his own son to the enemy rather than surrendering the fortress to the Republic.
Yeah, but according to the text, recent verified historical testimonies completely dismantled this foundational myth. The reality presented in the source is that Moscardo did barricade himself in the fortress, but he did so by hiding behind Republican women and children whom he had taken as hostages.
Wait, he used human shields?
Yes, hostages. Furthermore, that famous dramatic phone call where he supposedly tells his son to prepare to die for Spain, followed by the son's immediate execution by a firing squad. The source states the timeline is entirely fabricated.
You're kidding.
The son was not shot immediately after that call in Toledo. The entire narrative of heroic patriotic sacrifice was a theatrical invention. The author goes so far as to argue that Moscardo's actions amount to cowardice, yet he was enshrined as the ultimate Spanish hero.
So you have this dual mechanism. They completely erase the real heroes, like Franco's cousin, plunging them into a historical black hole, and they invent these cinematic fake heroes like Moscardo. And on top of that, they had to actively cover up the actions of their most brutal commanders. The text specifically highlights General Quiepodiano.
Quiepodiano is described in the text as perhaps the most prolific war criminal of the entire conflict. And he was a pioneer of utilizing modern technology for psychological warfare.
Using the radio, right?
Yes. He used radio broadcasts, which were a relatively new and incredibly powerful medium at the time, to terrorize the Republican population in Andalusia. The author notes that his unhinged, violent threats over the radio directly incited mass panic.
People were just terrified.
People were so terrified of what his troops would do that they fled en masse, which culminated in the horrific Malaga-Almería highway massacre, where tens of thousands of fleeing civilian men, women, and children were bombarded indiscriminately from the sea by fascist ships and from the air.
And the source notes a very specific, incredibly calculating detail about Quiepodiano. Amidst all this chaos, he issued a special, strict order banning all photographs in his zones of control.
No photos allowed.
He explicitly forbade any graphic documentation that could later incriminate the fascist forces.
Yeah.
He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was making sure there would be no visual evidence of war crimes.
When you connect all these points, you see a systemic, top-down strategy of historical engineering happening in real time. I mean, they aren't just fighting a physical war with bullets and bombs. They are simultaneously fighting a war against the future historical record.
Curating reality.
They are curating reality as it happens. And this curation extended well beyond the borders of Spain. As World War II was drawing to a close, and it became blindingly obvious to the entire world that Adolf Hitler was going to lose, Franco's regime realized they had a massive, highly incriminating paper trail connecting them to the Third Reich.
Right, because they had been actively collaborating for years. They shared intelligence, they shared resources.
Yes. So according to the source, Franco's brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Sr., who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and a known ardent Nazi sympathizer, gave a direct, urgent order to destroy all documents linking the Spanish regime to Nazi Germany.
They literally tried to burn the evidence.
They tried to burn their geopolitical alliance. The only reason modern historians know the true depth of this collaboration is because the Nazis were meticulous, obsessive record keepers, and they kept duplicate copies in Berlin that survived the war.
That is just wild. The arrogance to think you could just burn a few filing cabinets and erase a World War alliance. But the author makes a really sharp observation here regarding the long-term success of this whitewashing. They didn't just sanitize the past. The cultural legacy of those brutal fascist forces lives on entirely unchecked today.
It's still very present.
The source points out that the military units responsible for the worst atrocities during the Civil War, specifically the Legionnaires and the Regulars, the so-called Africanist troops, are still the most celebrated units in the modern Spanish military.
Yes, they are.
They're the ones who get the loudest cheers and the most airtime at democratic military parades today.
The text argues that these specific units still maintain strong, undeniable links to their fascist origins, often displaying extreme homophobia and misogyny in their subcultures. Yet they are revered by conservative sectors in Spain today. The machinery of manipulation successfully washed their history, transforming what the author considers war criminals into esteemed, untouchable patriots in the eyes of a significant portion of the modern public.
Okay, so if a regime can successfully rewrite its own civil war, if it can erase democratic heroes, invent fake ones out of whole cloth, and attempt to literally incinerate its ties to Nazi Germany.
It's a lot.
It's only a small step to erasing an entire nation's foreign policy. If Franco was willing to completely erase the democratic heroes of his own military to appease his base, imagine what he was willing to do when his own survival on the world stage was at stake.
Right.
This brings us to a piece of history the source claims was completely vaporized from the Spanish consciousness.
We're looking at the critical window between 1948 and 1953 and Spain's profound, whiplash-inducing geopolitical flip-flop regarding the newly formed State of Israel.
Right. Because if you ask most people today about Franco's Spain and its international branding, they'll think of the regime's carefully curated image. Franco as the sentinel of the West, the great unyielding defender of Judeo-Christian values, standing firm against the atheist communist hordes of the Soviet Union.
That was the brand.
But the source material reveals a completely different, highly pragmatic reality in the late 1940s.
The text states unequivocally that when the State of Israel was born in 1948, Franco did not support it. In fact, he actively threw the weight of his regime behind the Arab nations fighting against the creation of Israel.
Actively supported.
Yeah.
He didn't just abstain from a UN vote or send a strongly worded diplomatic cable. The text says Franco sent Spanish fascist volunteers to the Middle East to fight alongside the Arab coalition.
He sent troops.
And even more shockingly, he sent Nazi-designed airplanes, planes that Spain had either bought from Germany or built under German license directly to the Egyptian Air Force. Franco was literally supplying the aviation technology to bomb Israelis.
Exactly. And the text explains the underlying cold logic behind this decision. Franco was internationally isolated after World War II. He was a pariah.
Nobody wanted to deal with him.
Right. He desperately needed oil to keep his country's economy from collapsing, and the Arab nations controlled the oil. Furthermore, he placed a calculated geopolitical bet. Looking at the forces arrayed in the Middle East at the time, he was convinced that the Jewish forces could not possibly win that war. So he bet on the Arab coalition.
So he is militarily opposing the creation of Israel, sending men and machines to fight them. But then the calendar turns to 1953, and the geopolitical weather changes entirely.
The Cold War is ramping up.
The world is divided.
The Cold War changes Franco's calculus completely. The United States is urgently looking for staunch anti-communist allies to build military bases in Europe. And Franco, whatever his fascist origins, is fiercely, undeniably anti-communist.
He hates the Soviets.
So in 1953, Franco signs the Pactos de Madrid, the Madrid Pacts with the United States.
This is his absolute lifeline.
It is his salvation. He gets massive influxes of American financial aid, and more importantly, he gets international legitimacy. The U.S. essentially says, we know who you are, but you hate the Soviets, so you're with us. His regime is suddenly accepted by the Western Bloc,
Right.
But there is a massive problem.
The history.
Right. Suddenly, his very recent history of fighting alongside Arab nations against Israel using Nazi-designed planes, that is a massive radioactive political liability in Washington, D.C.
Imagine you are Franco's PR team in 1953. Generalissimo, the Americans are here with the suitcases of cash, but the State Department is asking some very uncomfortable questions about those planes we sent to Egypt 5 years ago.
What do you do?
What do you do?
Yeah.
According to the source, you don't just quietly drop the alliance and apologize. You completely erase it from reality. The text says this history was actively and successfully wiped from the state archives.
It vanished.
It vanished from the history books. Think about that if you are listening right now. Imagine your own country's foreign policy doing a complete 180-degree turn, and then the government just edits the National Archives to pretend the previous 5 years never happened.
And not only did he reinvent his current policy, but the regime went on a massive offensive propaganda campaign to retroactively change his identity. This is where the manipulation becomes truly audacious. They constructed the myth of Francisco Franco as a secret savior of Sephardic Jews during the Holocaust.
A savior of Jews, Franco,
Yeah.
the guy who was practically a pen pal with Adolf Hitler.
Yes, the text points out the staggering, almost unbelievable cynicism of this rebrand. I mean, it is a heavily documented historical fact that Franco sent the Blue Division tens of thousands of Spanish troops to fight alongside Hitler's army on the Eastern Front.
Thousands of them.
It is a documented fact that he allowed the Nazi Gestapo to operate freely within Spanish borders, hunting down Jewish refugees and political dissidents who had managed to cross the Pyrenees Mountains seeking safety.
So wait, where does this savior myth even come from? Did Goebbels' disciples just invent it out of thin air?
Well, As with the most effective propaganda, they took a small kernel of truth and violently twisted it to serve the dictator's needs.
Okay.
During the Holocaust, there were a few Spanish diplomats stationed in places like Eastern Europe and the Balkans who acted heroically. They issued visas and safe passage documents to Jewish refugees, saving thousands of lives. But, and this is the critical distinction the source makes, these diplomats acted entirely independently.
They weren't following orders.
They acted on their own moral conscience, and often they did so in direct violation of the strict orders coming from Franco's government in Madrid.
So they were going rogue, they were risking their own careers and potentially their lives to save people.
Precisely. But a decade later, when Franco urgently needed to launder his image for the Americans and the international community, the regime simply stole the credit.
Of course they did.
They claimed these rogue humanitarian actions were actually part of a highly classified master plan orchestrated by Franco himself to save the Sephardic Jews.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is how the propaganda machine took the genuine bravery of a few defiant individuals and used it as a sponge to wash the blood off the hands of a collaborationist dictator.
It's breathtaking.
Yeah.
To go from sending Nazi planes to bomb Israel in 1948 to marketing yourself as the Schindler of the Iberian Peninsula in 1953. And the fact that they got away with it. The author really drives home the point. This is what happens when a regime has total, uncontested control over every newspaper, every radio station, every archive, and every school textbook.
Truth isn't just malleable.
No, it's whatever the dictator needs it to be on any given Tuesday.
And to truly understand how this vast machinery of manipulation operated, we have to look closely at the man sitting at the controls. The source shifts its focus here from grand geopolitical strategy to the deeply personal psychological profile of Francisco Franco himself.
Because the machine reflects the operator.
Exactly, because the nature of the machine reflects the nature of the man.
Right. And again, the popular mythology, even among some historians, is that Franco was this cold, calculating ideological mastermind, a grand stoic architect of a new Spain.
That's the image he wanted.
But the essay completely dismantles that image. It paints a picture of a man who was, frankly, profoundly mediocre and driven by petty grievances.
The source uses a very specific Spanish term to describe him, a trepa.
A trepa.
It translates roughly to a climber, an opportunist. The author argues he wasn't driven by a coherent, complex political philosophy like some other dictators of the era. He was driven by a ruthless desire for power, a reliance on extreme cruelty tactics he learned in the brutal colonial wars in North Africa, and, remarkably, a tremendous amount of sheer luck.
Just right place, right time.
And crucially, the text argues his sweeping national policies were often deeply influenced by his own personal insecurities and familial vendettas.
And this is where the story gets so bizarre, it feels like a rejected script for a soap opera. Let's talk about the Freemasons. We mentioned them earlier as part of the grand conspiracy, but the source details why they became such a specific target.
The Freemasons became the great, all-consuming obsession of the Franco regime, and the source reveals a historical fact that was silenced for decades. Before the Civil War, Francisco Franco actually tried to join the Freemasons.
Wait, really?
Not once, but twice.
He applied twice.
Yes, and both times his application was rejected by the lodges.
Okay, let's pause and think about the psychology here. He gets rejected from what is essentially an esoteric fraternal organization. Why does he care so much? Why does a military man hold on to this specific grudge?
The text attributes this to his younger brother, Ramon Franco. Ramon was everything Francisco was not. Ramon was dashing, he was charismatic, and he was a genuinely famous, beloved aviation hero in Spain. He had flown across the Atlantic, and Ramon was an active, prominent Freemason.
So you have this classic, intense sibling rivalry playing out on a national stage.
Oh, completely.
The younger brother is the cool, famous aviator hanging out in the lodges, rubbing shoulders with intellectuals, and the older, insecure, intellectually mediocre brother is knocking on the door of the lodge and being told, sorry, you just aren't material for our club. Fast forward to the Civil War. Ramon actually aligns with his brother and the fascist forces. The source suggests this was out of basic family loyalty rather than deep ideological alignment. But tragically, Ramon dies during the war in a plane crash while on a bombing mission against the Republic over the Mediterranean.
And here is where the manipulation machine goes into overdrive to serve a purely personal family agenda. The text details how Franco's sister, Pilar Franco, who the source describes as highly corrupt and opportunistic herself, gave an interview during the modern democratic era where she outlined this completely insane conspiracy theory the family had invented regarding Ramon's death.
It's wild.
They claimed that his death wasn't a tragic accident or a standard war casualty. They claimed he was assassinated by the Masons. Pilar Franco claimed, with absolute unwavering conviction, that on the exact day Ramon died, Freemason assassins broke into his house to steal a secret manuscript he was writing.
A secret manuscript?
Yes. This manuscript, she claimed, was going to expose all their darkest, most sinister secrets to the world.
It's like a bad Dan Brown novel. It's pure fiction.
It is entirely fiction. But this absurd invention served a vital political and psychological purpose for the dictator. It cleansed the Franco family of the ideological stain of having a famous Masonic brother.
Of course.
By retroactively turning Ramon into a martyr who was murdered by the Masons, Franco justified turning his own personal rejection and familial embarrassment into a nationwide holy crusade. The source explains a grim demographic reality. Because Spain had very few Jewish people at the time due to the mass expulsion in 1492 and centuries of the Inquisition, the Spanish fascists needed a domestic scapegoat to mirror the intense anti-Semitism of their Nazi and Italian allies.
They needed a target.
Yes. The Freemasons became the designated substitute. They became the Jews of Spanish fascism.
They literally substituted one targeted demographic group for another to fit their local needs.
Precisely. The text states that there were only about 5,000 Masons in all of Spain at the time. The regime systematically hunted down and murdered between 2,500 and 3,000 of them.
Oh my God, over half.
That is an extermination rate of over 50%. And they didn't stop there. They weaponized the accusation. Masonry became a blanket, catch-all charge used to imprison, torture, and murder countless Republicans, liberal intellectuals, and especially those school teachers associated with the free institution of education we discussed earlier.
If they didn't like you, you were a Mason.
Exactly. If they didn't like you, you were labeled a Mason, and your life was over. The source describes a massive archive created in the city of Salamanca, completely dedicated to this anti-Masonic crusade. The regime literally built a mock theatrical Masonic lodge inside this archive.
A fake lodge?
A fake lodge. They decorated it with aprons, symbols, and artifacts stolen from actual destroyed lodges. They built this to show the Spanish public a physical, tangible representation of the evil they had supposedly eradicated from the nation.
They built a taxpayer-funded trophy room. It's the behavior of a serial killer on a state level. Now, while Masons were the primary physical target, the text makes it clear that virulent ideological anti-Semitism was still deeply embedded in the foundation of the regime, even without a large Jewish population to persecute.
Yes. The source highlights a figure named Onesimo Redondo, who was one of the key founders of the Falange. And for those who might not be familiar, you can think of the Falange as the primary Spanish fascist political party, heavily inspired by Mussolini's movement in Italy.
Right.
Redondo was the individual who translated and serialized the infamous, fabricated anti-Semitic texts, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, publishing it in the fascist newspaper to radicalize the base.
And this wasn't just some fringe guy handing out pamphlets. This is a founding father of the state's only legal political party.
Correct. And the text makes a critical, highly sensitive connection here. Redondo had deep, intimate ties to the Jesuits and was a close friend of Herrera Oria, a major leader of the sect who later became a highly influential cardinal.
So the church ties run deep.
The author points out that today, in modern Spain, almost nothing is known by the general public about the rabidly anti-Semitic ideas of these Falangist founders. And even more suspiciously, the historical ties between the powerful Jesuit sect and the origins of Spanish fascism seem to have been completely scrubbed clean from the historical narrative.
The source actually uses a great phrase for this. An aclarado, a special rinse, or a whitewash. It describes how the Catholic Church's institutional image has been kept immaculate by meticulously hiding these historical connections to fascist ideology.
It's very effective.
And it wasn't just powerful institutions that got this special rinse. The text talks about the psychological engineering of entire geographical regions.
Yeah, this is one of the most remarkable sociological claims made in the essay. The source points to specific provinces like Almeria in the south and Valencia in the east. During the Civil War, these regions were absolute strongholds of the Republic. Valencia was actually the last functioning capital of the Second Republic before it fell. Almeria had a deeply rooted Masonic, libertarian, and left-wing history that was totally antithetical to fascism.
But if you look at the political map
Today, according to the text, they are among the most reliably right-wing provinces in Spain, with a significant presence of extreme right and neo-Nazi sympathizers.
that's a total 180.
The source suggests this isn't just a natural, organic political shift that happens over time. It argues this is the direct result of decades of intense, targeted ideological engineering. The regime used schools, the church, and the media to entirely overwrite the cultural DNA of those regions, turning the descendants of libertarians into hardline conservatives.
If you are listening to this and wondering how a whole province just magically flips its political identity, think about your own hometown. Imagine if, for 40 straight years, every school textbook, every radio station, every local priest, and every mayor relentlessly pushed one highly specific, engineered version of your town's history, punishing anyone who disagreed.
It changes the reality.
How many generations does it take before the fake history becomes the only history? So we've seen how the regime erased its enemies, invented its heroes, hid its alliances, and turned personal vendettas into mass murder. They were brilliant at creating villains. But the source argues that the regime didn't just rely on its own lies, they were incredibly lucky.
Because of their enemies.
Yes, because their enemies repeatedly handed them the perfect weapons.
Which brings us to the mechanics of that violence, and a specific historical event that the text focuses on heavily to explain how this manipulation works in practice. I'm talking about the Badajoz massacre in August 1936.
Yes, Badajoz is a crucial turning point.
The author frames this not just as a battle, but as the exact moment the fascists deployed a specific, terrifying psychological strategy. What happened at Badajoz?
What's vital to understand about the Battle of Badajoz, as the text lays it out, is that this resulted in the first major systematic massacre of the war. It took place largely in the bull ring of the city.
A bull ring. Wow.
The author argues that the fascists, specifically what were known as the Africanist generals, a group that included Franco and Diano, were fundamentally changing the rules of engagement.
Let me stop you there for a second. What exactly does Africanist mean in this context? Because that's a term that might confuse some listeners.
It's an essential piece of context. The Africanist generals were the Spanish military officers who had built their careers fighting brutal colonial wars in Spanish Morocco in the 1920s.
Okay.
In North Africa, they had learned and perfected strategies of absolute psychological warfare, utilizing spectacular terror, mutilation, and the slaughter of civilian populations to crush resistance.
So they were bringing colonial tactics home.
What the author argues about Badajoz is that these generals took those colonial terror strategies, designed to subjugate a foreign population, and applied them directly for the first time to their own citizens on Spanish soil. It was a calculated theatrical use of terror to paralyze the rest of the country.
And they knew exactly how horrific it was and how terrible it would look to the international community, because the text notes their very first reaction was to handle the press. They immediately tried to coerce and silence the foreign journalists, Portuguese, French, American, who had witnessed the aftermath. They tried to throw a blanket over it.
They did. The author actually views the Badajoz massacre as perhaps the first real example of modern crimes against humanity by the fascist Nazi alliance in Europe, serving as a dark testing ground for the sophisticated horrors of World War II.
But they couldn't keep it quiet.
No. Despite the fascists' best efforts to silence the press and seal the borders, rumors and news of the slaughter leaked out and reached the Republican side.
And those leaks provoked a reaction, which the author says created a dynamic that still defines Spanish politics today. The text notes that communist and anarchist sectors on the Republican side, enraged and terrified by the news of Badajoz, began committing retaliatory atrocities of their own, though the author notes these were generally on a smaller, less systematic scale.
Exactly. And this introduces a dynamic the author emphasizes heavily, the weaponization of whataboutism. Because the Republicans retaliated, it handed the fascists and their modern ideological heirs the ultimate rhetorical weapon. The text argues that even today in modern Spain, you cannot publicly denounce the systematic crimes of Spanish fascism without a chorus of reactionary voices immediately responding with, "But the Reds did it too."
Deflecting the blame.
They point to the retaliatory violence to create a false moral equivalence. It's a mechanism designed to justify the initial state-sponsored terror campaign by claiming both sides were equally monstrous.
But the manipulation gets even more sophisticated than just simple whataboutism. This brings us to a concept in the text that I found truly brilliant from a dark psychological perspective: the exaggeration trap.
Ah, yes, the exaggeration trap.
When the news of the Badajoz massacre reached the Republican leadership and press, they didn't just report the facts, they inflated them.
According to the rigorous historians cited by the author, the initial leaks of the massacre were heavily exaggerated by Republican propaganda.
Why did they do that?
They were trying to rally international support, so they created a lurid mythos around the event. They claimed there were literal rivers of blood flowing out from under the doors of the bull ring. They claimed tens of thousands of people were murdered in a single, continuous slaughter.
Just really macabre imagery.
Yes, they painted these incredibly macabre pictures of priests walking through the stands choosing who would die, and fascist soldiers throwing parties in the arena while executing people.
And here's where the trap springs. Because the Republicans exaggerated the details, they accidentally handed the fascists the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card.
Precisely.
Let's think of it like a defense attorney in a murder trial. Imagine the prosecution has a completely solid case. The defendant absolutely, positively killed the victim. The forensic evidence is there. But the prosecution's star witness gets on the stand and, out of a desire for revenge, aggressively exaggerates.
Embellishes the story.
Right. The witness says, not only did he kill him, but the killer was 10 feet tall, he floated in the air, and he shot lasers from his eyes. Now, all that slick defense attorney has to do is put the defendant next to a measuring tape to prove he is of normal height and point out he doesn't have laser eyes.
And suddenly the jury doubts everything.
Exactly. By effortlessly disproving the absurd exaggeration, the defense attorney casts total doubt on the entirely true underlying fact that a murder took place. They use the lie to bury the truth.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism the text describes. By easily disproving the physical impossibility of rivers of blood and mathematically disproving the inflated death tolls, the fascist historical revisionists were able to completely invalidate the real, verified testimonies of the actual massacre.
They just threw the whole thing out.
They used the flaws and the hyperbole in their victim's narrative to dismiss the fundamental truth of the event. The author explicitly states, to these great specialists in manipulation wars, they were handed the weapons. The exaggeration allowed the perpetrators to sow generalized, paralyzing doubt, and ultimately it allowed them to walk away with total historical impunity.
It is a terrifyingly effective strategy. You don't have to prove your own innocence, you just have to prove that your accuser is hysterical or hyperbolic.
The text says that this dynamic is alive and well today. If you try to denounce the real, documented crimes of Spanish fascism online or in the media, a troll will inevitably appear to say the Reds did the same, or they will point to an exaggerated claim from 1936 as proof that the entire history of fascist repression is a left-wing scam.
The manipulation machine is incredibly adept at feeding on the loss of credibility of its opponents. It uses their factual errors as a shield against its own massive crimes. And the text provides two modern, staggering examples of how the left wing or individuals associated with it essentially sabotage their own historical memory movement.
Oh, this is fascinating.
The first is the truly bizarre case of Enric Marco.
This story is mind-blowing. The source calls it a monumental scam. This isn't just an exaggerated rumor. This is a guy who hijacked a cultural trauma for his own ego.
For years, Enric Marco was the president of the Amical de Mauthausen, which is the principal Spanish association representing the victims and survivors of the Nazi concentration camps. He was the public face of the survivors in Spain.
The public face.
He met with politicians. He went into schools, and he gave these heartbreaking, tear-inducing speeches about his supposed experiences suffering in the Nazi death camps.
And the reality.
The reality, as uncovered by a historian and revealed in the text, is that Enric Marco was never a victim of a concentration camp. He was a complete fraud.
A complete fraud.
The truth was that in 1941, as part of a bilateral agreement between Franco and Hitler, thousands of Spanish civilians were sent to work in German factories. Marco was one of them. He was a voluntary civilian worker for the Nazi war machine, getting paid to support the Third Reich, not a persecuted prisoner starving behind barbed wire.
The source notes that he didn't seem to be an active fascist agent sent to infiltrate the group. He was just a guy acting on his own bizarre narcissistic motivations. He wanted the spotlight.
Right.
But think about the catastrophic damage he did. You have a guy leading the Survivors Association, weeping on television, who turns out to be a fake. Imagine what the revisionist historians do with that material. They say, see, they're all lying. The whole victim narrative is a scam designed to get government subsidies.
He handed them a weapon.
He handed the fascist apologist a nuclear weapon to destroy the credibility of actual Holocaust survivors.
He absolutely did.
And that exact psychological mechanism, the hunger for a cinematic horror story leading to a collapse of credibility, brings us to an even larger, much more tragic example of collective mass psychosis: the stolen babies hysteria.
I really want us to handle this carefully because it is an incredibly sensitive issue that totally dominated Spanish media for years. Walk us through the narrative that took hold. What exactly was the stolen baby scandal?
Beginning roughly in the late 2000s, a pervasive narrative exploded across Spain that a massive, highly organized, nationwide mafia existed during the dictatorship and right into the democracy. The claim was that networks of right-wing Catholic nuns and doctors were systematically stealing babies from left-wing or economically disadvantaged mothers in public hospitals.
And how did they supposedly do it?
The mothers were supposedly told their babies had died at birth, while the healthy infants were smuggled out the back door and sold for profit to wealthy conservative Catholic families.
And the numbers being thrown around were just staggering. The media was reporting that up to 300,000 babies had been stolen and trafficked in this manner. That is an industrial scale of human trafficking. It would require the complicity of thousands of medical professionals over decades. How did this belief become so widespread?
The source points out that this national hysteria was largely ignited and sustained by sensationalist media. Specifically, it highlights a watershed moment, a highly graphic photograph published in a popular magazine called Interview.
Right, the photo of the frozen baby.
Yes. The magazine published a horrifying image of a dead infant kept in a freezer. The accompanying narrative claimed that this specific frozen corpse was a prop. They alleged that the mafia kept this body on hand to briefly show to grieving mothers as proof their child had died, before taking it back to the freezer to use on the next victim.
I mean, you can instantly see why that image caused an explosion of national outrage. It is pure nightmare fuel. It is the ultimate distillation of evil right-wing nuns torturing poor mothers. The political left rallied around this narrative as the ultimate proof of the regime's monstrous nature. It became an indisputable foundational truth of modern Spanish historical memory.
But according to the meticulous investigations detailed in our source material, when the legal system and the scientific community finally dug into these claims, when thousands of exhumations were ordered and modern DNA testing was applied to the supposed graves of these babies, the grand narrative completely collapsed.
What did the DNA actually show?
The primary scientific investigators and forensic institutes concluded that in the vast majority of cases, the babies in the graves were indeed the biological children of the grieving mothers. They had genuinely died of natural causes or medical complications at birth. There was no widespread organized mafia network selling 300,000 babies.
It was mostly natural tragedies.
Right. While there were certainly some tragic, isolated cases of irregular adoptions or falsified paperwork, as happens in many countries, the overarching narrative of an industrial-scale trafficking ring was a myth. The text categorizes it as a profound case of collective mass psychosis driven by grief and media sensationalism.
Okay, but here's the tragic irony that the source text really hammers home. While the entire country, the media, and especially the political left were hyperfixated on this exaggerated cinematic myth of the frozen baby and the evil nuns, what were they completely ignoring? What was the actual atrocity happening in the background?
They were ignoring the very real, extensively documented, and ideologically driven crimes of the fascist regime. The text explicitly points out that during the 1940s and 50s, the regime did have a systematic, state-sponsored program to separate children from imprisoned Republican mothers.
And not to sell them.
No, to brainwash them.
Yeah.
It was a documented program of ideological cleansing. The regime believed that Marxism was a mental pathogen. They placed these children in state-run orphanages or ultra-Catholic institutions to completely erase their family identity and mold them into obedient fascist subjects. There were thousands of documented cases of systemic torture, severe sexual abuse, and forced institutionalization within these centers. It was a verifiable crime against humanity.
I see the terrible symmetry here. We demand the movie villain version of evil, the secret network trafficking babies for cash. We put all our energy into proving the cinematic lie, and when the DNA evidence causes that 300,000 number to collapse, what happens?
The reactionary right wins the narrative war without firing a shot. They get to stand up and say, look at the left. They are hysterical. They exhume graves and find nothing. They invent massive lies about nuns and doctors. You cannot trust anything they say about the dictatorship.
And in that tidal wave of manufactured skepticism, the real victims, the children who actually were stolen for ideological brainwashing, the hundreds of mass graves still littering the countryside, the systemic torture in police stations, the genuine political repressions were minimized, mocked, or relegated to the fringes of political debate.
So what does this all mean? By trying to make a tragedy seem even worse to drum up outrage, did the opposition actually hand the regime the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card? And this dynamic, the source argues, acts as a protective shield for the foundational impunity of the modern Spanish state.
The 1977 amnesty law.
Exactly. The text specifically points to the 1977 amnesty law, which was passed during the transition to democracy and essentially decreed that the political crimes of the Franco era could never be judged or prosecuted.
The law of impunity, as the author rightly calls it, they point out the legal paradox. Crimes against humanity, by strict international legal definition, never expire. There is no statute of limitations on genocide. But in Spain, through this law, they magically do.
And when someone actually tries to challenge that magic, the system reacts violently.
Right.
The text brings up the famous Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón. He became globally famous for going after international dictators like Pinochet. But what happened when he attempted to apply that same international law to investigate the crimes of the Franco regime in his own country?
The Spanish justice system crushed him. They suspended him from the bench. They didn't argue the international law. They used a legal technicality from an entirely unrelated wiretapping case to remove him from power.
They just found an excuse.
And the cruelest, most Kafkaesque irony, as the source notes, is that he was also formally denounced in court for trying to investigate the Francoist crimes. And that formal denunciation was brought by the Falange.
Wait, the Falange?
The exact same fascist party responsible for the crimes he was trying to investigate in the first place.
That is unbelievable. The historical criminals use the modern democratic justice system to prosecute the judge investigating them. And that brings us to the most unsettling part of this essay. We've talked about the analog past, the 1930s, the 50s, but the source asks a terrifying question. How does this machinery of manipulation operate today, right now, in a modern 21st century European democracy with a free press?
The answer the text provides is through highly sophisticated sabotage and false flag operations.
False flags.
And the source points specifically to the involvement of ultra-Catholic sectors like Opus Dei. And if you aren't familiar with them, think of Opus Dei as a highly secretive, incredibly wealthy, ultra-conservative institution within the Catholic Church. They have historically held massive influence over Spanish politics, the judiciary, and big business.
And the text alleges they orchestrate false flag operations. A false flag is when you orchestrate an attack, but you design it to look like your enemy did it, specifically so you can discredit them or justify a retaliation.
Right.
The source gives a truly wild example of how this plays out regarding the global crisis of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Look at the Romanones case.
The Romanones case was an absolute media circus in Spain. An individual came forward and accused a highly prominent group of priests in Granada of severe systemic abuse. This wasn't just a local news story, it reached the absolute highest levels of the global church. It had such an impact that Pope Francis himself actually telephoned the accuser to offer his personal support and encouragement.
The Pope called him.
Yes.
That is the ultimate, highest level of validation a victim story could possibly receive.
Exactly. But then the case went to trial. And according to the source, the entire thing collapsed spectacularly. The accuser's testimony was full of gaping contradictions and fell apart entirely under basic legal scrutiny.
Oh, wow.
The only priest who actually ended up on the stand was acquitted of all charges, and the Pope had to issue a formal, embarrassing apology to the cleared priest.
Okay, so a false accusation happens. That's terrible, but it happens. But the source frames this not as an accident or the actions of a disturbed individual seeking attention, but as a deliberate, calculated strategy. They note that the accuser was affiliated with Opus Dei.
Yes.
The text suggests this was a spectacular, intentionally staged failure designed to plant a deep seed of doubt in the public's mind about all abuse victims.
And the source provides a second, even more direct example to bolster this theory of deliberate sabotage. The major Spanish progressive newspaper, El País, launched a massive, rigorous journalistic investigation into historical abuse within the Spanish Catholic Church. They compiled a database of nearly 3,000 real, verified cases, gathering heartbreaking testimonies from adults who were victims as children.
A Huge undertaking.
It was a devastating, deeply researched piece of journalism that threatened the institution's core.
A real threat. So how does the machine fight it?
The text states that another individual, also linked to Opus Dei, fabricated a completely fake identity and submitted a meticulously crafted, entirely fictitious testimony of abuse to the investigative journalists at El País.
Wait, a staunch defender of the church submitted a fake abuse claim against the church.
Yes. And their sole objective, according to the source, was to wait for the newspaper to publish their fake story as part of the database, and then immediately step forward into the right-wing media and say, "Aha, I made that entire story up. Your rigorous investigation is flawed. You didn't verify my story. Therefore, the public cannot trust any of the other 3,000 stories you published."
It's like a sociological vaccine strategy. You deliberately inject a weak, fake scandal into the media ecosystem so the public builds an immunity to the massive, real scandals happening right behind the curtain. The source literally calls this a terrifying level of psychopathy, willingly using the real trauma of abused children as a tactical shield to protect institutional impunity.
And when they aren't using sophisticated false flags, the reactionary establishment simply relies on flat-out denying statistical reality.
Just denying the numbers.
The text cites a massive landmark report published recently by the Defensor del Pueblo, the official ombudsman of the Spanish government. Using rigorous, anonymous statistical extrapolation conducted by sociologists, the report estimated that there are 440,000 unknown or hidden cases of sexual abuse within the Spanish Catholic Church accumulated since the 1940s.
440,000. That number is staggering to even comprehend.
It is, though the source notes it aligns proportionally with the data uncovered in other countries like France, which admitted to over 330,000 cases in their own church. But how did the Spanish Catholic Church and the reactionary media respond to this official government-commissioned statistical report? They dismissed it entirely.
They just ignored it.
They claimed it was just math, just theoretical mathematical conjectures, and not concrete proof of individual crimes. They flatly denied the statistical reality.
But the source points out an incredible, deeply revealing hypocrisy here, right? Because the progressive left-wing media did the exact same thing with the second half of that very same report.
Yes, this is a vital point the author makes about how cognitive dissonance and manipulation work on both sides of the political spectrum. That same ombudsman report estimated that there were over 4 million victims of sexual abuse in the secular sphere in Spain, abuse happening in homes, schools, and sports clubs outside the church. And according to the text, the progressive media practically ignored that number entirely.
Why? Why would the left ignore 4 million victims of abuse?
The source argues it's because acknowledging that horrific, systemic statistic ruins the idealized image of the modern Spanish citizen that the left desperately wants to project. Just as the fascists wanted to project an immaculate, holy Catholic Spain, the progressive left wants to project a highly civilized, advanced, morally superior European society.
It breaks their narrative.
Exactly. The left also needs to appease voters in regions like Andalusia, which historically voted socialist but remains deeply culturally Catholic and traditional. Confronting the reality of 4 million secular abuse victims shatters the progressive illusion of a utopian society, just as confronting church abuse shatters the conservative illusion of moral purity. Both sides curate their own reality.
So everyone is living in their own curated mirage, willfully ignoring the parts of reality that make them uncomfortable. And this brings us to what might be the most controversial part of the entire essay, the King's Omerta and the fake red ogre.
If the church is the moral pillar, the monarchy is the constitutional pillar. For decades after the death of Franco, the Spanish monarchy, and specifically King Juan Carlos I, was presented to Spain and to the entire world as the glorious, untouchable savior of Spanish democracy.
He was the guy who stood up to the coup attempt in '81.
Exactly. He was the man who supposedly guided the country out of dictatorship.
But the author paints a radically different, deeply corrupt picture. The source states that for decades, criticizing the king wasn't just frowned upon. It was a profound societal taboo.
It wasn't just frowned upon, it was actively prosecuted. The machinery of the state crushed dissent to protect the crown.
How far did they go?
The text gives the example of the satirical magazine El Gueves. When they published a cartoon cover mocking the royal family, a national judge ordered the police to literally seize every single physical copy of the magazine from newsstands across the country.
In a modern European democracy, they are sending police to confiscate comic books. And they went even further when a highly critical book was published online in the early 2000s called Un re gulp, a king blow by blow.
When that book started exposing the king's unknown history and alleged massive financial corruption, the right-wing political and media establishment didn't just write op-eds disagreeing with it, they utilized the ultimate smear tactic. They repeatedly linked the book to ETA.
ETA.
And for context, ETA was a violent Basque separatist terrorist group responsible for hundreds of murders. By linking the book to ETA, the establishment sent a clear, terrifying message. Investigating the financial crimes of the crown is synonymous with supporting terrorism and violence against Spain.
They weaponized the deep, visceral trauma of national terrorism to protect the bank accounts of a corrupt billionaire king. But the truth eventually leaked out, as it always does when the corruption is that massive. The king's scandals eventually forced his abdication. And the source highlights a fascinating revelation by a Basque nationalist politician named Iñaki Anzagasti. He went on television and openly exposed the Omerta.
The Omerta, the mafia-style pact of silence that existed among the elites in Madrid.
Anzagasti revealed that the upper echelons of society, the politicians from both major parties, the media moguls, the business leaders, they all knew. They knew about the king's rampant corruption, his secret bank accounts, his behavior. But exposing it was considered a state issue.
They believed, or at least they claimed to believe, that the Spanish democratic system was so fragile that if the king fell, the entire system would crash with him and they'd be back in a civil war. Or, as the author cynically suggests, perhaps they kept quiet because they were all deeply corrupted themselves and benefiting from the same system. The text concludes that for decades, Spaniards lived in a carefully constructed illusion, believing their kingdom was as clean, wholesome, and unproblematic as a Disney theme park, while the reality was entirely rotten.
But the king's immunity is only half the story of this democratic mirage, because a functioning democracy implies opposition. It implies that if the right-wing establishment is corrupt, the left-wing opposition will hold them accountable and offer an alternative.
It's about the mainstream left. The Socialist Party, the PSOE.
This is where the author's argument becomes a truly holistic critique of the Spanish state, leaving no political faction untouched.
Right.
The text observes a constant theatrical dynamic in modern Spanish politics. The extreme right, the traditional right, and religious institutions like Opus Dei have spent decades painting the Socialist Party as a radical, communist, anti-American, anti-Israeli red ogre.
The red ogre.
They constantly link the TRESOE to those old Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theories to keep their conservative base terrified, energized, and voting.
The right-wing media screams that the socialists are going to destroy the country, that they are a revolutionary Marxist threat about to burn down the churches. But the text argues that the reality is the exact opposite. The author claims that historically, once the PSOE actually got into power, they operated exactly like the fascist deep state they supposedly opposed.
The author provides a devastating, undeniable piece of historical evidence for this. The GAL, the Grupos Antiterroristas de Liberación.
Okay, tell us about the GL.
During the 1980s, under a socialist government led by Felipe González, a state terrorism plot was organized to fight ETA. The government utilized police and civil guards, but, incredibly, they also hired fascist and neo-Nazi mercenaries from countries like Italy, France, Portugal, and Argentina to do their dirty work.
Wait, hold on. We really need to pause and look at the sheer absurdity of this. You're telling me a progressive left-wing socialist government representing the victims of fascism bypassed their own military and actively went out to hire international neo-Nazis to kidnap, torture, and assassinate Basque suspects in southern France.
That is exactly what happened.
How did the socialist voters at the time justify that? Was there no internal revolt?
It's one of the darkest chapters in modern Spanish history, and it perfectly illustrates the author's point about the deep state. The socialists justified it internally as a necessary, pragmatic, dirty war to stop terrorism. But they botched it horribly.
What happened?
These mercenaries ended up kidnapping, torturing, and killing completely innocent citizens, like Segundo Moret, a businessman who had absolutely nothing to do with ETA. And the author highlights the dizzying manipulation that surrounded this when the crimes were finally exposed.
Right.
The right-wing press and the conservative Opus Dei radio stations loudly and righteously condemned the horrors of socialist state terrorism. Yet, as the text notes, the actual triggermen executing these crimes for the socialists were far-right neo-Nazis, the ideological brethren of the very people complaining on the conservative radio.
It's just a total paradox.
It was a closed loop of state violence that ultimately led to the Conservative Popular Party and the Communist Party briefly uniting in parliament to oust the socialists in certain regions, purely due to the toxic, bizarre political climate created by this state terrorism.
It completely shatters the illusion of a clean ideological divide. The text gives other examples, too, showing how the socialists didn't dismantle the deep state, they just became its new managers. The NATO referendum, for instance.
Yes, the author notes that the PSOE came into power in 1982, campaigning heavily on a no to NATO platform. Their slogan was, OTAN de entrada no. It was a massive rallying cry for the left.
But then they changed their minds.
But once in power, facing pressure from the U.S. and the European establishment, they completely flipped. They forced their left-wing electorate into a referendum and aggressively campaigned for a yes vote to ensure Spain remained integrated into the military alliance. Their economic policies were often ultra-liberal, breaking unions and privatizing industry. They just assimilated into the requirements of the existing power structure.
And their corruption was just as cinematic as the right wings. The text brings up the story of Luis Roldan, which, again, sounds like a movie script.
Luis Roldan is a perfect avatar for this era. He was appointed by the socialist government as the first civilian head of the Guardia Civil, Spain's militarized police force.
Okay.
The text details how he completely fabricated his university degrees, systematically looted the highly classified state funds meant for fighting terrorism, stole the budgets meant for building police barracks, and then, when the press finally caught him, he enacted a Hollywood-style escape, fleeing the country and hiding out in Bangkok.
But the darkest part is what the text says happened when Spanish intelligence finally caught him in Asia and put him on a commercial flight back to Spain to face trial.
Roldan, a man who had intimately directed the absolute darkest sewers of the Spanish deep state for years, turned to the police officer guarding him on the plane and genuinely, fearfully asked if they were going to throw him out of the door mid-flight over the ocean.
He honestly thought they would throw him out of a plane.
He knew exactly how the state he helped run dealt with liabilities.
So the supposedly radical red ogre is actually just running the same corrupt, violent, mercenary hiring machinery as the old regime, which makes the right wing's constant fear-mongering about a communist takeover just another layer of manipulation, a theatrical performance to keep the voters distracted. And the text points out that the machinery has a dedicated squad of pseudo-intellectuals and revisionist historians whose entire job is to maintain these dizzying narratives.
The author names several of these figures who are elevated by reactionary media to provide a theoretical, academic-sounding baseline for these absurdities. There's Ricardo de la Sierva, a former minister of culture, whom the text describes as a specialist in reviving those old anti-Masonic conspiracies, even going so far as to accuse the Vatican itself of being infiltrated by Masons.
The Vatican, wow!
There's Pio Moa, who, ironically, was a former communist terrorist with the GRI group, now converted into a radical fascist historian who blames the left for the Civil War. There's Cesar Vidal, who presents a more normal media appearance but defends the same Francoist justifications. And Fernando Garcia de Cortázar, a Jesuit priest who wrote massive bestsellers that provided a sanitized consensus history that kept the reactionary forces very comfortable.
These historians are the ones who spin the modern tragedies into conspiracies. And the text gives a stark modern example of this machinery in action with the 11M Madrid train bombings in 2004.
This is a perfect, tragic example. Following the horrific jihadist terror attacks on the commuter trains in Madrid, the right-wing government at the time made severe political errors.
What did they do?
They immediately blamed the Basque group ETA because an ETA attack would help them win the upcoming election, whereas a jihadist attack in retaliation for Spain joining the Iraq War would hurt them. When the truth emerged that it was jihadists, the government lost the election.
Ooh, it backfired.
To cover up those initial lies and errors, the author states that high-ranking, ultra-Catholic Opus Dei link ministers helped invent massive, sprawling conspiracy theories to suggest ETA and the socialists were actually behind it.
They couldn't just admit a political miscalculation. They had to weave a grand narrative.
Exactly. The text mentions one specific absurd subplot they promoted heavily in the right-wing press: a supposed secret phone call between a top socialist leader, José Blanco, and a French anti-terrorist judge who was allegedly married to a 33rd-degree French Freemason.
Oh my goodness, the Freemasons again.
They used this completely fabricated 6 degrees of separation link to suddenly pivot the narrative of a brutal jihadist bombing into a shadowy international Judeo-Masonic conspiracy orchestrated to bring the left to power.
It's the exact same playbook from 1936. When in doubt, blame the Freemasons.
The author notes that in any other modern European country, these figures spinning these theories would be considered deeply unhinged marginal voices. But in Spain, they enjoy immense prestige, prime-time media placement, and, according to the text, have the power to keep half the country in a state of permanent conspiratorial confusion.
And when actual, genuine left-wing disruptors emerge who refuse to play by the agreed-upon rules of this two-party deep state, the system unites to crush them. The text points to the rise of the progressive party Podemos following the devastating 2008 financial crisis.
Initially, the traditional media just ignored them, thinking they were a passing fad of angry youth. But when they started winning millions of votes and threatening the two-party hegemony, the machine attacked. The source says they were relentlessly smeared with fake news stories, fabricated police reports, and wild claims about illegal foreign funding from Iran and Venezuela, claims that were blasted on the front pages and then quietly dismissed by judges years later.
And crucially, the source argues they were roadblocked just as hard by the socialists themselves. Even when Podemos won enough votes to force a coalition, the PSOE systematically refused to grant them any real power, specifically denying them control over the Interior Ministry or the Secret Services, the actual levers of the deep state. They forced repeat elections until the new left was exhausted and weakened. Meanwhile, to counter this left-wing surge, the system enthusiastically facilitated the rise of the far-right party Vox, which the source claims was initially funded and promoted by the upper classes as a quick, aggressive counterbalance to terrify voters back into the center.
So the system perfectly protects itself from all sides. The right attacks the new left with state-sponsored fake news, the establishment left suffocates them in parliament, and the far right is unleashed on to terrify everyone into accepting the status quo. It's a closed loop. So who is left? Who actually sees the matrix for what it is?
According to this source, the only political entities that truly see the centralist Spanish machine for what it is and refuse to play the game are the regional separatists.
The Basque and Catalan nationalists.
Yes, and the text makes a very important nuanced distinction here. It's not just the left-wing progressive separatists who see it. Even the right-wing, deeply Catholic, conservative separatists in the Basque Country and Catalonia refuse to be assimilated by Madrid. They recognize that the Catholicism of the Spanish right is a fundamentalist, medieval, aggressive version that doesn't align with modern European Christian democracy. And they clearly recognize that the Socialist Party is stained with the exact same dirty war tactics, state terrorism, and corruption as the right.
They see that both heads belong to the exact same dragon. Because they know that no matter who is currently sitting in the prime minister's chair in Madrid, whether they wear a blue tie or a red tie, the one absolute taboo they all agree on, the one rule of the deep state, is denying the separatists their own state. It's the one thing that unites the fascists, the conservatives, the socialists, and even the establishment communists in Spain. It is the glue of the machine.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion, the grand paradox of modern Spain that the source presents to the reader.
Right. Let's synthesize this incredible, sprawling journey we've been on. The source paints a picture of a nation living a profound double life. On the surface, if you visit as a tourist or read international headlines, it's a modern European showcase. The text points out that Spain has passed incredibly progressive, avant-garde laws, like being one of the first countries in the entire world to legalize LGBTQ plus civil marriage and codify equal rights.
But behind that bright, progressive European storefront, the core machinery of the state still operates on medieval rules. The text notes the grim, contradictory reality that despite these pioneering, celebrated laws, Spain continually leads European statistics in violent hate crimes against the LGBTQ plus community year after year. The laws on the books change, but the reactionary, intolerant forces that the regime nurtured in the culture for decades simply ignore those laws and continue operating as they always have. The hardware is new, but the software is from 1939.
It is an absolute masterclass in long-game generational manipulation. A system surviving by constantly, cleverly changing its skin from fascist dictatorship to pro-American ally, from autocracy to parliamentary democracy, but never, ever changing its corrupted core. It's breathtaking to contemplate the scale of it.
It truly is. The author concludes with a dark comparison. While the German Nazis manipulated their people into total fiery destruction in 12 short years, the Spanish fascists used manipulation to win a war, perpetuate their power peacefully for decades, and successfully engineer the reality, the memories, and the political boundaries of an entire nation for over 80 years. They won, as the text calls it, the undisputed world championship of manipulation.
And that leads to the final provocative thought that the source leaves us with. It's a chilling question, and I want to put it directly to you, the listener. Think about the massive 80-year timeline we just covered today. This regime successfully hijacked reality. They vaporized democratic heroes, they invented cinematic myths, they hid international alliances from their own people, they covered up massacres, and they successfully convinced half a country of a vast invisible Masonic conspiracy and a 300,000 baby theft ring. But think about how they did all of that.
They did it using purely analog tools.
Exactly. They used censored ink and paper newspapers. They used rumors whispered in town squares and cafes. They used stolen paper manuscripts. They typed out false flag testimonies on mechanical typewriters. Their most potent, nation-shaking weapon in the stolen baby's panic was literally a printed photograph of a frozen baby in a glossy magazine. They built a hologram house using the rudimentary, slow analog tools of the 20th century.
So the question we must ask ourselves as we look at our own society is this. If a deeply entrenched system could completely hijack the collective memory, the voting habits, and the reality of a nation using just paper, radio waves, and whisper campaigns, what happens to a machine like that in the digital age?
That is a thought I want you to mull over today as you go about your life. In an era of hyper-realistic deepfakes, of artificial intelligence that can generate fake historical documents and photographic evidence in seconds, of algorithmic social media designed specifically to feed us outrage and confirmation bias at the speed of light. If you understand the analog mechanics of the past, are you truly ready for the information wars of the future? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it challenged you. We hope it made you think deeply about the nature of the reality you consume. And above all, we encourage you to relentlessly question the narratives handed to you. We will see you next time.